It is a great pleasure and privilege to be here today and to be able to talk not only to you, which I'm going to do in the next hour, but I hope also with you in subsequently. There won't really be much time for questions and discussion at the end of this session, and I don't like that anyway, so you've got 5 minutes to ask questions, and it never works. But I'm here all day, so please feel free to stop me if you want to discuss anything. I also welcome emails, and you'll find my email on the last slide. So if you want my PowerPoint, or if you just want to dialogue, do get in touch with me by email. And then there's something enticingly called high tea with me. At the end of the day, I'm looking forward to that with eager anticipation, which is a chance to talk both with me and with each other. So I don't think it necessarily has to be an hour of you to me, but it can also be people talking across that. And it's about anything, I think, that has interested you, or puzzled you, or provoked you, or in any way raised ideas with you in the course of the day. Now, I want to start by quoting from the stated aim of the Contesting Early Childhood book series, which I had the great pleasure of editing with this very important Swedish researcher. Some of you may know Gunilla Dahlberg. And this book series has about 15 books. I'll touch on it later on. But it says at the beginning, this is what we were trying to do. This series questions the current dominant discourses surrounding early childhood and offers, instead, alternative narratives in an area now made up of a multitude of perspectives and debates. A multitude. So I think that those terms of reference, whatever you want to call it, captures the two main themes in my work, which is on the one hand contesting, questioning, what I would call dominant discourses. We'll come on to that again in a bit. And at the same time, helping to give voice to the diversity of alternatives that are there if you are able to hear them. And indeed, these are the themes of my presentation today, which is about, on the one hand, resisting, questioning, if you like, the dictatorship of no alternative, that wonderful phrase of the Brazilian social thinker Roberta Ungar, and celebrating diversity in early childhood. So, my presentation today falls into 3 parts. I'm going to start off by arguing that early childhood education, I put early childhood in brackets because I think many of the things I'm talking about apply across the educational field. And I'm a little bit obsessed these days with the need to break out of particular sectors in education into looking across the whole field. I think early childhood, compulsory schooling, higher education, they all need to be looking to each other and talking to each other and realizing that they all face some of the same issues. And I think the dictatorship of no alternative in early childhood is expressed in a story that insists that it is self-evidently the only way to think, talk, and practice. It kind of says, this is the truth, this is how it is. But I want to argue in the second part that there are indeed alternatives. And those alternatives you can hear if you listen to what I call a resistance movement, who are telling other stories. And these other stories can and should feed into what I see as a democratic politics of education, in which there is no dictatorship of no alternative, but people putting forward different stories, different ideas, a diversity of perspectives, putting them in the forum for people to discuss and argue and perhaps reach some consensus about. And finally, I'm going to talk about some challenges and some hopes. Okay. So let's start with the dictatorship of no alternative, or put another way, how certain stories about early childhood education come to claim that they are the only stories to be told. So my starting point is the importance of stories. Now, as Jerome Bruner and many others have recognised, mankind has an innate tendency to communicate and to make sense of existence through stories or narratives, whichever word you want to use. And of course today there is actually a burgeoning interest in narrative, in story, in lots of disciplines. Not less so in early childhood than many other fields. But increasingly an interest in how people, how societies construct themselves, their identities, etc., through the stories that they tell. Because these stories shape how we think and what we do. For example, about the environment. And in a way, I sort of got into this area some years ago when I read the manifesto from the Dark Mountain Project, which is a group of artists, I think in the United States, who are very engaged. Who are very engaged in environmental issues. And they say in their manifesto, we believe that the roots of the converging crises of our times lie in the stories we have been telling ourselves. We will reassert the role of storytelling as more than mere entertainment, because it is through stories that we weave reality. So the stories we tell ourselves are the way we create a reality for ourselves, the way we make meaning of the world, the way we understand things on there. And when I read that, it kind of got me very interested in this. And then, of course, I found, like you always do, that people have been into storytelling for years. You know, you feel such a fool. Why did you never notice this stuff in the first place? So that's a kind of main theme of what I'm going to talk about. And the idea of storytelling applied to early childhood education is the theme of a recent book I've written in the Contesting Early Childhood series. This is the advertisement on there. And the book is called Transformative Change and Real Utopias in Early Childhood Education, the story of democracy, experimentation and potentiality. And just to be clear, my preferred terminology for services for all children from 0 to 6 is early childhood education. I never use childcare these days or daycare. If you want to, we may come back and discuss that. And I think it is really important what identity we choose to give to early childhood services. You would be free to call them something else, but this is what I choose. And so I'd be very happy to have that discussion about why that's what I like and why I don't like terms like daycare and childcare, even though they're everywhere in my country. The book is provoked by an irritation, no, that's too much, a dislike for a particular story in early childhood education. For my argument in the book is that early childhood education is increasingly dominated by a particular story which I call the story of quality and high returns. This is, if you like, the book title, the story title. And in a nutshell, the story goes like this. If you apply the correct human technologies, sometimes people use the word quality, at the right time, i.e. when children are young, you will get very high returns on this investment, including improved education, improved employment, higher earnings, and a big reduction in all sorts of social problems, delinquency, addiction, crime, you name it. And then we all live happily ever after. You can even reduce the story to an equation in which quality plus early intervention equals increased human capital, which is the economistic term very much used today in justifying early childhood education, and reduced dysfunction. Okay, so that's in a nutshell. I'll give you some examples in a moment. Now, I've used the term human technologies here, and I've said actually another way of using that term is quality, but I like human technologies. But let me explain what it means. I take it from what I think is a really wonderful book by the British sociologist Nicholas Rose. The book is called The Powers of Freedom. And he describes human technologies like this. They are technologies of government, for governing. for the shaping of conduct in the hope of producing certain desired effects and averting certain undesired events. Now, I think when the word technology comes up, we immediately think of electronic stuff, mechanical stuff, gadgets like smartphones and things. But Nicholas Rose is making the really important point that there are lots of other forms of technologies which can be said to be the ways in which we find the ability to shape conduct and to get people to do what we want them to do. And these technologies have been evolving now for a long time, at least for 100 years. And here are just some of the technologies that are used in early childhood today. Child development concepts and knowledge, which set up ideas of stages and how children should be and enable us to tick them off if they've achieved them. Developmental and learning goals, prescriptive or detailed curricula, pedagogical and other programs like developmentally appropriate practice, child observation techniques or surveillance, you could say, and normative assessment methods, regulation and inspection regimes, payment by results. You may not have them in Canada, but this is what we now have in England, where people in centres are paid according to how well the children do when they are assessed against various goals. And technical or very positivistic research of the type of what works on there. So, those are just some examples, and let me just bring to your attention the latest example of human technology in early childhood education. Do you know OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development? It's a very powerful international body. It is made up of rich countries such as Britain, US and Canada, about 35 rich countries. It predominantly works on the economy, but increasingly has worked on education, and it is introducing what they call an international early learning study. And this will be a cross-national assessment of early learning outcomes to be assessed by testing 5-year-old children in participating countries. Now, you know about PISA? Yeah? Assessment of 15-year-olds. So this could be seen as a preschool PISA for 5-year-olds. I used to joke, actually, it won't be long before they have a PISA for 5-year-olds, and then, of course, they'll never elect Trump. But it's there. The first study, which will include between 3 and 6 countries, will be between 2017 and 2020. Now, I'm part of a growing opposition. I say growing because this has been going on for 2 or 3 years, and virtually nobody outside government knew what was going on. I mean, people from Canada were part of the group planning this, and I expect almost impossible to find out who these people actually were. But they were there, together with other governments, planning this. And it's only just kind of emerged that this is going on. And a lot of people are getting very concerned about it and trying to say why we think it's a very bad idea. And a number of recent articles have been written setting this out. And this comes from one of them that I wrote with several other people, including Alan Pence from the University of Victoria. We say that this international early learning study may lead to growing standardisation and narrowing of early childhood education as the study tail increasingly wags the early childhood dog. And it's a technology because it is shaping conduct. Countries, if this spreads, as with PISA, countries will be saying, what do we have to do to get up the league table? And then we have to go and see what other countries are doing, and then we have to apply the same thing. So this is another example of this powerful combination of human technologies that are around today. Anyway, let me return to the story of quality and high returns and give you some examples of, I have a collection of these stories, I just picked a few which I think are particularly powerful. And the first example again comes from OECD. They've become very involved in education, early childhood education, very influential player today. And this is from a report they made. Looking at early childhood education and care as an investment makes sense because the costs today generate many benefits in the future. economists, such as Nobel Prize winner James Heckman, and he pops up in the story all the time. He's kind of the hero of this story. He's an economist at the University of Chicago. He's very into human capital. Anyway, economists such as him have shown how early learning is a good investment because it provides the foundation for later learning. The big insight from these economists is that $1, €1 or a yen spent on preschool programs generates a higher return on investment than the same spending on later schooling. But early childhood education and care needs to be, here it comes, of sufficient quality with the right human technologies to achieve beneficial child outcomes and yield longer-term social and economic gains. So you see the key words: investment, economists, return on investment, sufficient quality on there. And then a little nearer to home, though not home, the United States, this comes from a press release from the Obama White House at the time of his State of the Union address when they were going to put a bit more money into early childhood. Research has shown, and that's a very common start to the story, like once upon a time, research has shown that taxpayers receive a high average, here it comes, return on investment in, here it comes, high quality early childhood education with savings in areas like improved educational outcomes, increased labour productivity, and a reduction in crime. Okay. And just so to show you, if you like, the story can be a picture story. Here is the front cover of a report from my own country, and you note the title: Early Investment, Early Intervention, Smart Investment, Massive Savings. And you'll see, I think it's on my right, but you see all those gold ingots. My word, that's a lot of massive savings, isn't it? And on the other side, you have a healthy brain, and a little wizened brain, which apparently is supposed to be a child who has been neglected. And I think it's one of the MRI scan, but actually it's a very contested picture, this. And it's when people have tried to work out where it comes from, it turns out to be quite problematic. But you see the power, the imagery, healthy brains, wizened brains like a little old walnut, and if you have a nice healthy brain, you get all these gold ingots. Now, Canada isn't, of course, exempt, and I do have an example from Canada in the book, but I think, for example, Fraser Mustard was one of the main storytellers in Canada, the story of quality and high returns. But yeah, I could go on. I've got also other examples. It's very, very common thing. I don't like this story. I don't like it. I should rephrase. I mean, in a sense, one of the things I'm saying today is, what stories do you like and do you listen to? And I don't want to say people shouldn't like this story. It just happens that I don't. But I'm trying to say you have choices to make. Yeah. And I like it for several reasons. First of all, incredulity. I don't believe it. I don't believe it produces these massive investments. I always take the United States as the example. The United States has, for 40 or 50 years, invested huge amounts of money on early intervention and innumerable research projects on this. Everybody knows the High Scope Project, the Abecedarian Project, the Chicago Project. These are quoted to justify the story. But if you stand back from these small-scale local studies and say, what's happened in the United States over the last 50 years? Well, the answer is, things have, if anything, got considerably worse for children and families. If you look at the poverty level, it is today roughly at the same level it was in 1964 when Head Start was introduced in Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. If you look at the US, in virtually any international league table of well-being of children and families, it comes at the bottom with countries like Turkey and Romania, and yet it's the wealthiest country in the world. It just doesn't deliver. And I think one reason for this has been because inequality in the United States has skyrocketed in the last 50 years, and whatever small good early childhood may have done in that context has been completely swamped by the bad consequences of increased poverty. And that leads me to my second objection, that actually the story is naive and reductionist, because it assumes a technical fix. Early childhood high technologies can actually solve problems that are deeply structural and political, caused by inequality and injustice. It's kind of saying, look folks, we don't need to bother about inequality. Just put in the right early childhood education, all will be well, and we can all carry on the 1% accumulating more and more on there. So it's naive and reductionist. My third reason I don't like it is because it inevitably leads, I believe, to increasing governing of children and adults. You see, to work, the technologies have got to be precisely applied if you're going to get these precise returns. So really, to make it work, you've got to govern children and adults very carefully to make sure that they do the right technical stuff. Right? So that's the third reason I don't like it. The fourth reason is that the story offers a poor image. If you know Reggio Emilia, you know that they would talk about the image of the rich child as being central to their wonderful pedagogy. Well, here we're offered a poor image of the child. In this story, the child is an empty vessel into which we have to pour stuff, information and stuff. And the child essentially reproduces what we feed into the child. But the story also offers a poor image of the teacher, because in this story what the teacher has to be is a technician. They have to be good at applying what they're told to apply, what the rule book says they have to do. And it offers a very poor image of the early childhood centre, or I would say the school, because the image is that the centre is an outcomes factory. It's children are fed in and fed out the other end with outcomes. I don't like it because it's a story of standardisation and uniformity. It wants universal technologies to achieve universal outcomes, ignoring context, no place for context, ignoring complexity, diversity and alternative perspectives. Uniformity and standardisation is at the heart of this, the belief that there is one right way to work across the world with children to achieve one right set of outcomes. And last but not least, I dislike the story because it is a story of the search for the one true right way to the only destination. So, to recap, the story of quality and high returns is a story about predetermined and universal outcomes, developmental goals, readying for school, that dreadful expression term everybody seems to speak these days, about learning goals, and these in turn will achieve other longer term outcomes, higher earnings, lower unemployment, falling crime and so on. It's a story about using prescribed and standardised methods, those human technologies, and it offers the prospect of huge returns if only you keep to the script. In sum, it's a story in which the goals, the aims, the outcomes are determined and not up for question. The only room for debate is how to improve the technologies. Now, what I want to make clear is that this story did not drop out of the sky one morning. It's dominant in early childhood education for a reason. And for me, the reason is because it is the product of a dominant paradigm and a dominant political economic regime. It's a product of bigger stuff going on. The paradigm is positivism, that belief that you can apply the assumptions and the methods of the natural sciences, like physics, to the social sciences, like education, to produce universal laws and objective truth. This is not actually how the world works. Social sciences should not be equated with natural sciences because they involve people, and people completely mess up the possibility of developing universal laws. People are a nuisance from that point of view. The paradigm of positivism believes that you can actually achieve a kind of natural science approach to the social world. And the regime of neoliberalism carries a belief that life can be reduced to economic values and relationships, in particular relationships of competition and economic self-interest, in which we are all trying to get the best return for ourselves and our children. I think positivism leads for this search for answers that are universally true, irrespective of context or perspective. The need to control diversity. Diversity is a pain if you're a positivist. because it stops you being able to arrive at universal rules and guidelines. It just messes, it's messy. And positivists, in many ways, are trying to struggle with the messiness of life to arrive at these nice scientific rules and regulations. And neoliberalism leads to this economistic reasoning, this language in education of high returns and investment and human capital. And it also leads to a search for technologies that will produce predetermined outcomes and returns on investment. Because if you think of education as an investment, you need to know what you have to do to get your 5% or your 10% or your 15%. You need to know that on there. It also, neoliberalism replaces politics by managerial and technical practice. You're not interested in democracy. You actually want the guy to tell you what works and the manager to make sure that it's applied. So all that, I think, is to some extent the bad news. But the good news is that there are alternatives. So the dictatorship and no alternative is Donna, and there are alternatives is Tara. I may introduce these ladies to you again later on. The story of quality and high returns doesn't listen to or acknowledge other stories. If you read policy documents, which for my sins I do, because I feel I ought to just check out what's going on, you never find them referring to the many people who are not telling this story. It's not even a reference to the fact that some people don't agree with the story of quality and high returns. We're rendered invisible on that. And the story of quality and high returns believes it's the only true story and that there are no alternatives. Actually, Donna and Tina, they're sisters. Tina, there is no alternative. Donna, the dictatorship, no alternative. But there's a growing resistance movement to the dictatorship of no alternative in early childhood education, and it is telling other stories. There are, as I read out at the beginning in the Contesting Early Childhood series blurb, there are alternative narratives in an area that is now made up of a multitude of perspectives and debates. I think that's really important. There is, once you begin to listen, once you begin to look, you will find there are people everywhere who are working with a diversity of perspectives and debates. Now, I've referred to a resistance movement. Who do I mean? Who are these resistance movement people? Well, here are just some examples. For example, there's a growing literature. I've plugged my book series, Contesting Early Childhood. That's got 15, soon 16 books, but there are lots of other books who are writing, exploring alternative approaches. There are very interesting journals. The one that I think particularly important is Contemporary Issues in Early Childhood, although I recognise for people who don't have access to a university library, these are cripplingly expensive. That's a real problem. These things, I know that. Then there are networks, global networks of people who are exploring alternatives. I think many of you will know what began in the United States has now spread wider, the Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education Group, which holds an annual conference and has a journal itself. And of course, the Reggio Emilia network is very well known, but there are others as well. Teachers and students. I get the pleasure to examine quite a lot of doctoral students' work, and it's fantastic to see how doctoral students, or the ones I get to see, are working with different paradigms and theories and perspectives. It's really great. And indigenous groups. Just a few, the Maori in New Zealand, which has led to New Zealand's very innovative curriculum, Te Horiki. Indigenous people in Australia and First Nations in Canada, to give but a few examples. Now, this resistance movement is telling alternative stories, and it's working with different paradigmatic positions. In other words, actually most of us in the resistance movement have been positivists. We've kind of been there, done that, so we kind of understand it, and we've struggled. It's a bit like struggling to get free of a black hole. We had to get away from it. And many people are working, for example, with paradigm like post-foundationalism, which is a bit of a mouthful, I apologise. In a book that Gunilla Darberg and I wrote, we said Post-foundationalism values complexity and multiplicity, subjectivity and context, provisionality and uncertainty. It recognises a close relationship between power and knowledge, in which power functions through knowledge, and what is deemed knowledge is a function of power. This idea that power and knowledge are very closely related is very central to alternative paradigm. This idea that what we accept as knowledge is, to some extent, created by power relations, and that power relations are supported by certain types of knowledge. So that's a very important idea. This is Foucault. Yeah. This paradigm, post-foundationalism, recognises any phenomena, early childhood education, for example, has multiple meanings. Any knowledge is perspectival, depends where you stand, what you know, and all experience is subject to interpretation. Now, this is very different, for example, to people telling the dominant story who are located in the positivist paradigm. Their position would be almost entirely the opposite to that. And the resistance movement is also working, I think, with a very exciting and rich variety of theoretical and disciplinary perspectives, as well as pedagogy and education. They're working with philosophy, political science, human geography, sociology, science studies, feminist studies, physics, and so on. So the wealth of discipline and theory that people are working with in this resistance movement is fantastic. And also, people in the resistance movement are using different vocabularies expressing different views about early childhood education. So in the story of quality and high returns, you can see the kind of vocabulary that's very common today: child development, developmentally quick practice, early intervention programs, assessment scales, investment, all that sort of stuff, finishing with my bête noire, quality. Other stories you may find very different language: projects, potentialities, possibilities, uncertainty, wonder, surprise. I think put on it joy and fun. In between, images, and so on and so forth. And I think this is really, really important language. If you want to tell different stories, you need a different vocabulary. It's incredibly liberating once you stop trying to use the story of the vocabulary on the right-hand side. You can't tell other stories with that vocabulary. But once you start working with another vocabulary, you are liberated. And I've just been working for 3 years on the writings of Loris Malaguzzi, and it hits you in the face immediately. He talks such a different way, not just the Italian language, but the words, the language, the vocabulary, just is amazing. So I think it's fantastic. Once you can break out of this kind of stilted, impoverished language, yeah, wonderful. But I think that the resistance movement questions, and this is a really important point, what is the first practice in early childhood education? What do I mean by first practice? So, the story of quality and high returns treats early childhood education as being first and foremost a technical practice. The key questions are technical: what works? How can I improve the technology? So technical practice is the first practice. That's what you're always starting from. What does the evidence tell us? What can we do to make things work better? The alternative storytellers treat early childhood education as first and foremost a political and ethical practice. Technical practice matters, of course it does. You can't do anything without technical practice, but it should always serve politics and ethics. If you believe that you start with politics and ethics, it's in the service of politics and ethics. So putting political practice first means starting with political questions. What do I mean by political questions? Well, the political scientist Chantal Mouffe describes them like this: political questions are not mere technical issues to be solved by experts. Right? So technical question, what works, you can ask a technical expert to answer for you. Political questions always involve decisions which require us to make choices between conflicting alternatives. The political question sets up alternative possible answers, often conflicting. You have to choose. Can't rely on a technician or a manager. You've got to decide. And Loris Malaguzzi understood this, absolutely. So in the 1970s he's writing, pedagogy is always a political discourse, whether we know it or not. It's about working with cultural choices, but it clearly also means working with political choices. So the challenge that these resistance movement, alternative stories are raising is that we have to make political choices. And what do I mean by political questions? Well, here are some of mine. And since one of my questions to you today is, what are your political questions? What are your... So here's some of mine. What is the diagnosis for our time? What do we think is happening in the world today? And how should education relate to it? Personally, I think we've moved into an incredibly deep and complex period of crisis, and education has failed to respond to that, but other people will have other diagnoses. What is your image of the child? That fundamental Reggio Emilia question. What is your image of the educator or the early childhood centre? What is knowledge? How do we learn? What does education mean? What a word we throw around all the time. Education this, education that, but what is it? What's it for? Why do we have early childhood education? What are its fundamental values and what ethics do we work with? What kind of society do we want? What do we want for our children now and in the future? Now these are just some, and I would really be interested to know if you have others or you disagree. These are political questions, so there isn't a right choice of questions and there aren't right answers. But my answer to these questions leads me to tell another story in this book, and I call it the story, and it's a very catchy title, Democracy, Experimentation and Potentiality. Let's call it DEP for short, which is an awful mouthful. So, if the story of quality and high returns is about an instrumental rationality, how do I get some things out of people that I want from them, economistic relationships and technical practice, if that story is about the value of certainty, predictability, objectivity and so on, if that story is about schools as outcomes factories and places for taming, governing and standardising, places of closure, if that story is about children following predetermined pathways, being future-proofed for an inevitable future of more of the same, which I believe it is, the story of DEP is very different. It is about democracy as a fundamental value, and I know that's not original. I am standing on the shoulders of giants in talking about democracy as a central value in education. John Dewey to name but one, but many other people, and that's what many of these alternative stories are doing, is reclaiming the giants of the past who we're told we should escape from because the past is something to get away from. So the story of DEP is about democracy as a fundamental value. Democracy understood, of course, as a way of governing, how you manage your school, for example. But it's also democracy as a way of life. John Dewey, he said it's a form of associated living, how we live with each other. It's about how we relate in everyday institutions, like schools. And there's quite a literature today about democracy in the preschool, if you want to go into that in more detail. Is democracy understood as being based on listening and dialogue, diversity and multiple perspectives, confrontation, being prepared to argue your point with somebody else, and negotiation? And is democracy understood as learnt by doing? It's not something you teach in a lesson. You learn by doing it. It's not a subject to be taught, but a lived experience. So, the story of DEP is about democracy as a fundamental value. It's about the value of the new and the unexpected of movement and experimentation. And one of the books in the Contesting Early Childhood series is called Movement and Experimentation in Early Childhood Education. It's about how can we get that going again in our schools. And here's how I describe it in this book. Experimentation is about bringing something new to life, that which is not yet known. Something that is interesting and remarkable, whether that something is a thought, knowledge, a project, a service, or a tangible product. It expresses a willingness, a desire to invent, to think differently, to imagine, and to try out different ways of doing things. To go beyond what already exists, to venture into the not yet known, to be surprised and not to be bound by the given, the familiar, the predetermined, and the norm. So it's a love of experimentation, meaning that you want to take the risk of doing something different, something new, not really knowing what is going to happen. That's what's so wonderful about Loris Malaguzzi. He's kind of saying the really important thing in education is wonder and surprise and uncertainty, and finding something we never knew we would find from there. And I think it's absolutely sign up to that. So the story of death is about democracy and experimentation, and finally it's about the infinite, the unknowable and the unpredictable potentialities of children, educators, parents, and early childhood centres. And this idea of potentiality is captured by Baruch Spinoza, who is a 17th century philosopher, he's more than 300 years old. But look how he said, we never know in advance what a body can do. So this is about potentiality. We don't know. Every day we go into school what the body might be able to do. And we're open to that. We don't try and close it down by saying we're only interested if they can do these outcomes. John Dewey, human experience can have no end until experience itself comes to an end. Same idea. And Kalina Rinaldi from Reggio Emilia, the potential of the child is stunted when the end point of their learning is formulated in advance. Okay? So if you know what you expect and want out of the child, then you're going to really muck up their potential. And indeed, the only thing you will see is what you're looking for, and you will miss acres, vast swathes of things children are doing which are not what you're looking for. And I want us to focus a bit on the potentiality of the school or the early childhood centre, because the story of Quality and High Returns, I think, has the image of them as outcomes factory. They're sort of enclosure where human technologies can be applied to children to produce high returns. In the story of DEC, the early childhood centre is a public space. It's really important. It's not a business selling a product. It's not an enclosed school. It's a public space. It's a place for the encounter between citizens, young and old, where many, many, many projects are possible. Those projects may be social, cultural, political, economic, or ethical. Education, certainly, but many other things can happen in this space. They should be, as Loris Malaguzzi puts, living centres of open and democratic culture. So he saw them as places where democracy was being constantly renewed in the society, but also they were places creating culture, a culture of childhood. They were shaping how societies that understood, thought about, valued children. And they can be places for the practice of democratic experimentalism. That's Roberta Longo again. Experimentation which involves lots of people working together. I think the potentiality of early childhood centres is expressed very well in a wonderful little red book by somebody called Kerry Facer. It's called Learning Futures, in which she writes about the potentiality of the school. Let me just quote, I think it's really important. The school, she's interested in the impact of technology on schools. And of course, one argument is, actually with technology we don't need schools anymore. Children can just sit anywhere in front of a screen and you don't need teachers or anything. And she is arguing, although she's very au fait with technological developments, is the school is an essential institution. Maybe one of the most important institutions we have to help us build a democratic conversation about the future. Physical, local school where community members are encouraged to encounter each other public space, meeting each other, and learn from each other. This is one of the last public spaces in which we can begin to build intergenerational solidarity, respect for diversity and democratic capability, which is needed to ensure fairness in a period of socio-technical change. It is therefore the time both to defend the idea of the school as a public resource, not a private business, and to radically reimagine how it might evolve if it is to equip communities to respond to and shape socio-technical changes. So she's saying the school, these are some of the projects I mentioned: intergenerational solidarity, respect for diversity, democratic capability, and communities taking some control over their futures. Some of the projects that a school can actually have. Now, the story of DEC is just one example of alternative stories. I want to stress, it is not the other story, it is an other story, and there are many others. Telling and valuing alternative stories is part of a democratic politics of education that contests the dictatorship of no alternative. Dictatorship of no alternative says there's only one story, take it or leave it, that's it. But if we believe in a democratic politics, we know, we value, we want to hear different stories. And the democratic politics of early childhood is inscribed with the values of diversity and complexity, and it makes assumptions, values, perspectives visible and contestable. And so, to my last part, challenges and hopes. I have argued that there is a resistance movement contesting the dictatorship of no alternative, and it is made up of people and groups who desire research and practice alternatives. And we should recognise and we should celebrate this movement and its rich diversity. It's all over the world, and all we have to do is to listen and we can hear it. But I also recognise that the dictatorship of no alternative, is very powerful. It has many resources. How many billions of dollars have been spent on trying to regulate and control early childhood education, not to mention compulsory schooling? Vast sums have been poured in to this project of management and technology. And Donna doesn't recognise or hear other stories. So there are many challenges facing the resistance. And I've picked out 4, but you may see others, and we may want to add those later on. The first one is an individual challenge to us as individuals, to each one of us. I call it building a politics of refusal, and I take that term from the, again, very important British sociologist Stephen Ball, who writes very powerfully, very critically about the way in which education is increasingly being governed in neoliberal regimes. Is really important if you're interested in that. A politics of refusal, he says, questions what kind of self, what kind of subject have I become, and how might I be otherwise? So it's he's saying, what's my identity become? And also, could I have a different identity? And he goes on, the politics of refusal is the care of the self. I like that expression. How can we care for ourselves? Which really means actually how can we have an identity that we like, that we feel comfortable with. It's the work of the politics of the self, a continuous process of introspection. It's the art of voluntary inservitude or reflective indocility. This is a form of ethics and a set of techniques of living, a concrete practice of freedom. So this is really how can we, if you like, deconstruct how we have been, the identity we may have had put upon us, and how can we create our own identity. So, a politics of refusal resists the dominant discourse, trying to define my identity, my subjectivity, my perspective. The challenge is how and where can this politics of refusal be provoked, developed and supported? If you want to practice a politics of refusal, if you want to work on who you are, how and where do you do it? Do we have places where people can do this? How can we practice what Stephen Ball calls the art of voluntary inservitude, reflective indocility? Where can we practice indocility? And what is the role in all this for educational institutions, for daycare centres, for schools, for public and private organisations, and for informal and formal networks? So that's my first challenge, which is a very personal one. The second one is a collective challenge to the resistance movement. As I said, networks and connections exist within early childhood education. I've given some examples, there are many others. People linking up to try and resist and develop alternative perspectives. But how can that be extended and strengthened? How can the resistance movement build alliances and solidarities, for example, with other sectors of education? How could early childhood work with compulsory education, work with higher education, where there are people trying to resist their own dominant discourses? And I don't see very much interchange going on between different sectors of education, even though there are people there all struggling in their little patches. And how can we build alliances with social movements committed to futures that are more democratic, just, fulfilling and sustainable? Early childhood education, I think, has got to be in relationship with other forms of movement. For example, community movements, environmental movements, movements fighting for justice and recognition. So I think this is a very big challenge. How can the resistance movement in our little field begin to link up with people who are also resisting, to begin to build that idea of what we want for our children here and now and in the future? Challenge number 3, developing policies or conditions to enable real utopias. To achieve transformative change means not only having a desirable vision of what you want, but paying attention to creating the conditions to achieve it. And there's a very interesting, it's American sociologist called Eric Olin Wright, who has written and done a lot of work on what he calls real utopias. And the 3 features of a real utopia is that they're desirable, yeah, you know what you want, but they're viable. You can find examples of people trying to make them work, case examples, whatever, and they have to be achievable. What conditions would you need to put this desirable vision into practice? And that's why this book is called Transformative Change and Real Utopias, because I am struggling in this to think about what conditions would the story of Depp need to be enacted. So I think this is extremely important. And coming back to Reggio Emilia, it's the most extensive and sustained example of progressive public education ever. It's a network of nearly 50 schools. And this network has been doing incredible work and is still moving and experimenting 60 years after the first school. When most interesting experimental projects collapse after 5 years or so. So this is an amazing example of a real utopia. And it's successful because the city understood the importance of creating right conditions. They combine vision with intense practicality on the workforce. What sort of workforce do you need? What sort of support systems do you need? What sort of environment should you build? What sort of management structures do you need out there? And I think, that we need to have that there's an unfortunate split between people who do policy and people who do practice. They need to come together because policy has got to be related to the practice you want, and practice has to say, I need the right conditions in place. And one without the other is going to fail. And I have to say that the neoliberals understood this whole importance very early on. Milton Friedman, professor of economics from Chicago, who was the guru, the godfather of neoliberals, in the 1960s, before neoliberalism had swept to power, with other neoliberals, was planning and working on conditions. And this is what he wrote: only a crisis produces real change, I think that's really important. Today we're in crisis. The chance for real change is very, very likely. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. So I think in Canada, in Britain, in the United States, everywhere, people in early childhood education need to be working on those policies, what they want to see when the crisis comes and change becomes inevitable. It's no good like the banking crisis. The banking crisis comes and nobody on the left had any ideas what to do with it. Yeah, wasted opportunity. We've got to be ready to say, okay, now is the time to get the changes that we really need to actually have the sort of early childhood education we desire. So we need to do much more work on conditions, structures, policies to support and sustain the enactment of alternative stories. And my final challenge, I think, because we're talking about diversity today, but I think in early childhood education we need to work the tension between coherence, what we all have in common, and diversity, the possibility of having difference within that. So I think that a really good early childhood system needs certain common conditions, covering the whole of British Columbia or whatever. Universal access based on a universal funding system. Equality throughout the system, whether it's 1-year-old or 5-year-olds. A shared identity through, I would say, a framework curriculum, a short curriculum of values and goals. Adequate resources, capacity for experimentation. And actually, I won't go into it now, but if you look at Sweden, which in my view is preeminent in the world in early childhood education, they have set out a really strong common framework. And boy, do they experiment within that. They have a lot of diversity within it. But they can do that because they have the basics right. And then within that, people can actually try and do different things. So I think there's an interesting challenge here to work on the balance to be struck between diversity and alternatives, which we probably all think, I think, is a good thing. We don't want it uniform. So you go into a centre in Vancouver and somewhere else in BC, it's identical. We don't want that. But on the other hand, what sort of coherence and uniformity do we want, for example, throughout the whole of BC? Okay, to conclude. We've moved into a time, in my view, of multiple and deepening crises. The dominant stories in the environment or the economy, for example, are losing their credibility and appeal. Early childhood education, as I've argued, has alternative stories and people who are beginning to listen to them. It's a case of Tara, there are alternatives, confronting Donna, the dictatorship, no alternative. And we need to continue to work on alternative stories and alternative conditions, linking desirability and achievability. And we need to continue contesting the dictatorship of no alternative with a democratic politics of early childhood that celebrates diversity. So I'll leave you with a question. What stories or story about early childhood education do you like to listen to? And what do you like to tell? And my final slide, you can see it's got my email, so remember that point at the beginning. Do get in touch if you can't catch me today. If you're interested in the Contesting Early Childhood series, there is a website there run by the publisher Routledge. Latest book is a fantastic book of the writings and speeches of Loris Malaguzzi, really important. And you can also get a free essay written by myself, Gunilla Dahlberg and others called Why Contest Early Childhood. Just Google the title and Routledge and it'll pop up. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.